In this video, as promised, you're going to go ahead and create a form that shows up on the homepage of the weather website. That'll give users an input where they can type in their address, they'll be able to click a search button, and then the forecast information will show up after it's fetched. Now to kick things off, we're going to start over in index.hbs by writing a little HTML. We're going to go through the process of creating our form with the text input as well as the button. Now I'm going to leave the header in place and then the paragraph down below, just inside of our main content div. Just before we close that, we're going to go ahead and use the form tag to create a form. Now with form, we create a separate opening and closing tag. Then inside of there, we're going to create the input and the button. Let's go ahead and start with the input. Input is an empty element. There is no separate closing tag. And then down below, we have button. Button does have a separate opening and closing tag. And right inside, you put the text for your button. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use search as my button text. Now, if I go ahead and refresh things over in the browser, what do we have? We have our little form showing up. From here, we could customize the input a little more. I'm going to go ahead and add a placeholder so we have some text showing up inside of here until you actually type something. That's going to make sure you know what you're supposed to type in there. To do that, over inside of index.hbs on input, I'm going to set up the placeholder attribute, giving it a value equal to whatever I want to show. So in this case, I could show location as an example. Now, if I was to refresh things, I would see that showing up in gray until I actually type something like my location, then that shows up instead. So now we have a very simple form. The problem is that if we were to submit it, nothing would happen. It's not wired up with our client-side JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and address that. We're done with the markup and we're going to move into app.js and figure out how we can do something when someone clicks that button and submits that form. To get started, the first thing we need to do is select the element from our HTML document that we're trying to work with. And we do this using document.querySelector. Now we pass to this a string, and the string inside of here is very similar to the strings we were using in our CSS file to select things we wanted to style. We selected body, or we selected something by class, footer, header, and so on. Now in this case, we are trying to select the following our form so we can grab it by its name right here, form, and we're done. Now what comes back from that is a JavaScript representation of that element, and we can use that to manipulate the element or to do things when a user interacts with the element. So right here, const, I can call this weather form, just a way to store that variable so I can access it at any point in the future. And down below, the first thing we want to do is figure out how to run some code when someone submits that form, because that code is going to be responsible for fetching the weather and getting everything rendered correctly. To do this, we need to add an event listener onto our element. So there are all sorts of event listeners out there. There are event listeners for hovering over something like the header, for scrolling on a page, for clicking a button, or for submitting a form. Next, to actually add it, we use weather form.add event listener. Now in this case, we need to pass in two arguments. The first is a string, the name of the event we're trying to listen for. As I mentioned, there are dozens of different events that are supported. And the second is a callback function, which runs every single time that event occurs. In our case, the name of the event is submit, and the function is going to run every single time the form is submitted. And for the moment, all we're going to do is log something to make sure it's working, console.log testing. Now, if you're interested in learning more about how you can work with elements in client-side JavaScript, I cover that in detail in my JavaScript bootcamp. For this course, we just need a little client-side code in order to wire up our forms correctly. Now, this is not going to work as expected. We're going to talk through why, we'll make a few changes, and we'll get things working. If I actually refresh the page, what are we going to see? I can see the following error show up. Cannot read property add event listener of null. So that means it can't read a property on weather form. It's saying that weather form is null, which it shouldn't be because I already set up the selector. The problem has nothing to do with our code. It has to do with the order in which things are happening. In index.hbs, we're loading in our script file in the head of the document, which means the script is actually running before everything down below is rendered, before the form is even parsed. So what we need to do is fix that. All we're going to do is take this script, I'm going to cut it out of its current location in the head, and I'm going to bring it to the very bottom of the body. So just before that closing tag, after the footer, I'm going to paste that exact same line in. Now, this isn't going to show anything new in the browser, even though it's in body. Instead, it's just going to make sure that our script runs after all of the elements are available. That'll allow us to actually select the form and set up our submit listener. If I refresh the browser once again, what do I have? Right here, I don't have an error, which is a great start. Because we're not seeing that error, we know that our form event listener must have been set up correctly, and hopefully our code runs when the form is submitted and we see testing print down below. Now, we are going to see testing print, but only for about 1/10 of a second. So before you click search, pay attention to what's going to show up right here for you in your browser. I'm going to click it, and I can see that testing showed up and it immediately went away. What happened is that the browser actually refreshed completely, and that means that our message was cleared. So the default behavior of forms is to completely reload the page, and that made sense a long time ago, before we had access to good client-side JavaScript. Now though, what we're going to do is use fetch to fetch the data, and we'll dynamically add it onto the fly, so we don't need to refresh the page a bunch, causing a flash of content or confusing the user. We'll be able to preserve everything on the page like what they've typed inside of the input. So if I type in test and I click search, I am going to see testing show up, the browser refreshes and everything's reset. That's not what we want. We don't want to refresh the page on form submission. We want to run this JavaScript code instead. To do that, all we have to do is grab the argument that's provided to our event callback. It is an event object. You could call it event. I typically call it E. That's typically what you're going to see around the web. And then we use a single method on it. It's the only method we're ever going to use on this event object. It is e.prevent default. Prevent default is going to prevent that default behavior, which is to refresh the browser, allowing the server to render a new page. And instead, it's going to do nothing. It's just going to allow us to do whatever we want by letting the function run. So with our code change in place and the file saved, we can refresh the browser. I'm going to type in something like my location. I'm going to click that search button, and what happens? I see testing print down below, which is great, and the browser isn't refreshed. So by setting this up, we've told the browser that we're going to handle everything. It doesn't need to do what it usually does. Now, currently, we're not handling everything. We're just logging testing, but now we're in a good position to get the address the user provided and then use that address to fetch the forecast. Now it's time to go ahead and grab the value the user typed in the input. And once again, we are going to select the input. Then we're going to use various code to manipulate it. Let's go ahead and start by selecting it so we can actually use it in JavaScript. Const search or any other variable name would work, like search element as an example. And we are going to get the value from, once again, using document.querySelector. We're going to go ahead and find the element by its name, input, perfect. Now we have access to search, and we can extract its value right here after the user submits the form. So they type a value in, they submit the form, we get the value, and we use it to fetch the forecast for that location. Right here, to get the value, we will create a location variable, and it's accessible on search, which is a representation of our input, and that is search.value. So value extracts the input value, which is whatever's typed in, and here we're just storing it in the variable. Now let's go ahead and log that as opposed to logging testing. So right here, we're going to grab the input text value and we're going to dump it to the console when the form is submitted. I'm going to save app.js. I'm going to refresh the browser. I'll go ahead and type something in. Let's go ahead and use Austin. I'll hit enter or click the search button and I can see my result down below. I'll switch that up to something else. I'll go ahead and use Portland. I'll click the search button, and once again, the text provided shows up right down below. So now we have our form in place, and we're actually getting the text when it's submitted. From here, we're going to use that text to generate the URL that will pass to Fetch. That's actually going to be your challenge for the video, so let's talk about what I'd like you to do right down below. Right here, your goal is to use the input value to get the weather. Now for the moment, we're going to continue to just log things to the console, like the forecast or the error. That's okay. We'll wrap up the user interface in the next video. For you, you want to, one, migrate the fetch call into the submit callback. So right now, fetch runs even if no one ever submits the form. We want all of this code to live right here inside of the callback so it only runs when the form is submitted. Next up, you want to use the search input text value as the value for the address query string. So whatever someone types in here needs to end up right here in the URL. So we want a dynamic URL where we use the form input as the address query string value. Next up, you're going to go ahead and test your work. You can submit the form with no value inside, and when you do that, you should see you must enter an address down below. You can try something invalid, and when you submit that, you should see what we have right here, unable to find location. Then you can try something valid, and when you submit that, you should see the location and the forecast printing in the terminal. Don't worry about trying to print things to HTML. We'll cover that in the next video. So take some time to knock that out, test your work, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd you do? Let's kick things off by migrating the fetch call into the submit callback. Right now it's getting called even if no one ever submits the form. I'm going to cut it out of its current location. I'll remove those extra empty lines, and we're going to bring it in down below. We're going to remove that console.log and paste the fetch code right in. Now we're only ever fetching when the form is submitted. In its current state, the problem is that we're always fetching the following address, which is invalid. We're not using the value the user types in, which we have in that location variable. So for step 2, you needed to make sure to fix that. Right here, I'm going to remove the hard-coded address value, and I'll just concatenate on using the plus operator, whatever value is stored in location. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's valid, or maybe it's invalid. I don't care. I'm going to pass it through to the API, and the API will determine if they can do anything with it or not. Now we can save app.js, and down below, step 3, we can test our work. I'm going to remove the challenge comments. I'm going to make sure that I do save my file so the latest code is running. I'll refresh things in the browser, and what do I have? I have my page. I'm going to start by searching for nothing. When I do that, I get you must provide an address. From there, I'll search for something invalid like the exclamation mark. I get unable to find location, try another search. After that, I'll search for a valid zip code. That's my zip code. And when I do, I get the location and I get the forecast printing in the terminal. Now we're not quite done yet. Everything is still printing in the terminal, though we do have the important stuff all wired up. In the next video, we're going to wrap up the weather application by getting a few styles in place and getting the location, forecast, and error messages printing to the user interface. I'm excited to get to that. Let's jump right in to the next one.